Thank you very much, Flavia. And just so that everyone can follow along, I'm going to put into the chat right now a link to the slides in a PDF format. So please feel free to, anyone who can open that, you're more than welcome to follow along as we move forward with tonight's very fun topic, the big leap, transitioning to middle school for students with IEPs. Next slide, please, Flavia. So my name is Alita Fisher. Everyone who knows me well calls me Lee. I'm the executive director of CASE, the Community Alliance for Special Education. I'm a professional special education advocate. I have 4 kids, 3 of whom have IEPs. So this ain't my first rodeo, as the expression goes when it comes to middle school. So tonight we'll be talking about who we are at CASE, what our students' rights are, what things are different in middle school, potential updates to your student's IEP when it comes to middle school, some advocacy strategies, and we'll leave time for Q&A. Next slide, please. Now, just to make sure we get off on the right foot here, want to make sure I explained what we're going to be talking about today, so I'll skip past that section. But one thing to really be careful of, because this is being recorded, please, we will not talk about today specific students. Keep all examples general and relatable to the whole group. Because this will be on YouTube, we don't want to share any personally identifying information. And the same thing with schools. The concepts we're discussing are applicable at all schools. And if you do want to talk in more detail, please bear in mind that at CASE, we do free consultations with our advocates, and the link to schedule one of those is later in the presentation. Also, keep in mind, we do not provide magic solutions or quick fixes. This is a process that takes time. You often hear us say it's a marathon, not a sprint. We're not attorneys. We're not therapists. We are lay advocates. So we're providing advocacy advice here, not legal advice, not therapeutic advice. But we can refer you to other folks, and so can the folks that support for families if you do need more of that. So next slide, please. So our norms here today, please be kind, courteous, and respectful. Assume positive intentions. Everyone has something to learn from everyone here in the room. We all have something to share that's valuable. And this is a collaborative, judgment-free zone. One diva, one mic. Step up, step back. Please make sure to share room with others, share space for others in the room. Stay on topic, please. Feel free to use the chat as a parking lot. We will respond to questions, but it might not be right at the moment. And please ask for clarification as need be. We'll do our best to explain terminology, including acronyms, but always ask for clarification. That's good self-advocacy. We believe in strong self-advocacy. So next slide, please. All right, so we've had this feedback from previous presentations. Why are you reading everything directly from the slide? I can do that. Well, we're modeling best universal design and inclusive practices because not everyone can read these slides. We recognize that there are people who have visual disabilities in the room, might have low vision, might be blind, or people with visual processing disabilities might need things stated verbally. And there's a lot of people in the room whose primary language is not English, and they're using interpretation to access the presentation. So when we say what's on the slide, it really helps our interpreters make sure that the full meaning is across in all the languages in which this will be shared. A couple examples of this. I don't know, me as a mom, I used all those curb cuts on the hills of the sidewalks here in San Francisco, pushing my double stroller around. It made the streets accessible to me. They came out of the Americans with Disabilities Act. That's when they were mandated in the early 90s. They weren't intended for me, but I benefit from them. So that's part of why we believe in universal design. It's just great best practices. So next slide, please. Okay, and you will notice throughout the presentation, we do not use the term special needs. We use the term disability. Special needs was not a term developed by the disability community. It is not a term that's defined in law. It erases the expertise of disabled adults who find it infantilizing and inappropriate. and it doesn't cover the entirety of people with disabilities. So I'm going to read one quote here from Rebecca Coakley, who's a guru in the disability justice movement. And her blog post that goes into much greater detail is listed here. Special needs gives the impression that the rights of people with disabilities are special or extra. We have the same rights as everyone else. How we access these rights may differ, but disability rights are fundamentally the same civil rights as all people. When you imply that the act of accessing our rights is special, it gives the rest of the public a pass to treat us as though our rights are a special privilege, and then we get harassed for it. So I would highly encourage everyone to read the blog post. If you're following along on the slides, it is linked in there. Those should be hyperlinks that you can click on, and we will put it into the chat for you as well. Next slide, please. So who are we at CASE? This is a slide that we are not going to read, but I do want to just make sure everyone knows that we provide our services on sliding scale. We were founded in the 70s to ensure that all students with disabilities had equitable access to their public education. We provide support around IEPs and 504 plans. That's our lane. That's our specialty. That's where we stay. Other questions we refer out to other folks, including our friends at Support for Families. So next slide, please. And our services, we provide free consultations, direct advocacy support, and mentorship and training like this tonight. We have more information on our website for anyone who wants to dig deeper. But next slide, please. This is going to be the tension tonight, is reading everything from the slides and also getting all the way through the material because we have a lot to cover. So a shameless plug for the Special Education Rights and Responsibilities Manual. CASE and Disability Rights California have co-authored this easy-to-use guide to help families and professionals navigate special education services. It's available in multiple languages on the website, and so we highly encourage everyone to check it out. Next slide, please. So now we're going to get into some of the meat of the presentation, understanding your rights. And we recognize that this is going to be review. So next slide, please, Flavia. Now, just so that everyone knows, this is also part one of a 4-part workshop series that we give in conjunction with Support for Families, Know Your Rights, and we have that coming up at the end of the month. So if you want more details about understanding your rights, the procedural safeguards, things like that, please join us at the end of the month. We have more information on that in a few slides here. But some really important concepts to understand as we move forward tonight. Child find. Schools must find and evaluate students suspected of having disabilities at no cost to the parents. This is true of everyone who lives within the geographic boundaries of a school district, even if it's a student in a charter school, private school, or parochial school. FAPE, free appropriate public education, must be available to all children residing in the state between the ages of 3 and 21, inclusive, including children with disabilities who have been suspended or expelled from schools. If you are being called to pick your child up in the middle of the day and you have to leave work, all of a sudden that's not free anymore. That's costing you time and earned money. If you're being told, oh, go get some outside tutoring for that, that's not free anymore. So many examples where FAPE is an important concept to understand. Least restrictive environment is the third concept here. Children with disabilities are educated with children who are non-disabled, and special classes, separate schooling, or other removal of children with disabilities from the regular education environment occurs only if the nature or severity of the disability is such that education in regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. So we hear families ask for more services like, can I have some para support for my kid in their general ed class? Maybe that would help keep them engaged. Maybe if we tried another technique or had some specialized services to support my student, that would help them access their education. When a school says, no, we want to move them to a special day class instead, we refer back to LRE and say, Aren't you supposed to put those supplementary aids and services in gen ed before moving a kid to a more restrictive environment? One of the ways that we make sure that districts follow their LRE mandate. So, next slide, please. Okay, now procedural safeguards. Every time you go into an IEP meeting, you should be offered your procedural safeguards. It's that packet that says procedural safeguards on it, and that's a fancy way of saying your parents' rights or your students' rights. So, what are these rights? It's to participate. Parents have the right to refer their children for special education services, to participate in the development of the IEP, and to be informed of all program options and alternatives, both public and non-public. Let that sink in for a minute. We sometimes call this meaningful parental participation. And this is really important because, especially that last part, both public and non-public, very often we hear things like, well, we don't have that program here at our school. Well, our school doesn't do that. Okay, tell me the options for other places where it does exist. If we all think that that's what this student needs, let's figure out where to provide it. To receive prior written notice. Parents have a right to receive prior written notice in their native language when the school district initiates or refuses their request to initiate a change in their child's identification, assessment, or educational placement in special education. When you ask for things, for example, I want an assessment. Great, they should send you a prior written notice. Prior written notice basically just means they're going to write things down. They're going to tell you what they're going to do or what they're refusing to do. In an IEP meeting, if you ask for more services and they say no, they should send you a prior written notice explaining why. They should put it in writing. Document, document, document. Next slide, please. All right, and predetermination. We think predetermination is a really important concept to understand. It's a procedural violation. It's a big deal. So we just talked about meaningful parental participation. Predetermination is the opposite. In matters alleging, well, this is a very technical paragraph. So rather than read it, I think what I'm just going to make sure that everyone understands is that, actually, I will read it. In matters alleging a procedural violation, a hearing officer may find that a child did not receive a free appropriate public education, FAPE, if the procedural inadequacies significantly impeded the parent's opportunity to participate in the decision-making progress regarding the provision of a free appropriate public education to the parent's child. Basically, what that says is if the district doesn't let the parent participate, they're denying FAPE, and that's not okay. So what we hear sometimes, but we don't offer that here. We don't have the staff or training to implement that service or program. The school staff met before the meeting and we decided blah, 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 without parental input. So those are just some of the areas where we hear it and we push back. Next slide, please. What are the parents' rights in special education? Continued to consent. You have to be provided with informed written consent before anything happens. And you have the right to refuse to consent as well. You have the right to a non-discriminatory assessment using tools that are not biased. If your language is not English, your first language is not English, and your student's first language is not English, then an assessment can be provided in their first language. Should be. And using tools that are culturally relevant. Next slide, please. And you have the right to receive an independent education evaluation if the assessments that are in fact provided to your child are for some reason something that you don't agree with the findings, they're not complete. There's many things, we'll get into some of this later, but you have the right to an IEE, independent education evaluation, at public expense, at the district's expense. Next slide, please. This is just a screen grab of a chart that there's a law firm named F3 that they published. This is a really informative chart. The link is below. It should be hyperlinked in the slides if you have them from the chat. If not, we'll make sure we put the link in for you. But This is a great overview of the legal timelines that a district has to follow. If you request an assessment plan, they have to give that to you in 15 days, not say things like, oh, sorry, we're too busy, we'll get to it when we can. So understanding these legal rights can be really, really powerful. And if you call an IEP meeting, there's no such thing as an emergency IEP meeting. But if you request an IEP meeting, the district has to offer you one within 30 calendar days, not say, meh, your annual IEP is coming up in 2 or 3 months. We'll just talk about it then. That's not okay. So anyway, next slide, please. Now, this was a brief overview of what we go into much more detail in our part 1 of our workshop. So please join us on February 21st if you want the full presentation. And here are some other links to the full procedural safeguards, to the special education timeline overview, and many of the presentations that CASE has given for and with Support for Families can be found on the Support for Families YouTube channel. That's linked here, along with the Special Education Rights and Responsibilities Manual. So this is a slide chock full of resources. Please use all of them. Next slide, please. All right. So now, we wanted to give you all that information just so you understand a little bit about your rights and your students' rights as we frame things moving into middle school. So next slide, please. Elementary school versus middle school. This is a huge, huge leap, and we're not just talking about the size of the building. It is a much bigger building generally when we're talking about middle school, but think about the fact that in elementary school, your student has one teacher, one main classroom where they spend the majority of their day. Specials such as art, chorus, orchestra, those are with all of their classroom peers. Lunch is usually with their classroom peers, maybe other kids in the same grade level, but generally the lunches are staggered. PE happens with classmates. Now, when you get to middle school, instead, it's one teacher per subject. And depending on the middle school here in San Francisco, that can be 6 periods, it can be 8 periods. Your classroom changes each Valor period. You choose an elective or you participate in an elective wheel. Some schools have a wheel where for one quarter you get band, the next quarter you get art, the next you get STEM or robotics or something. And all students in the same grade very often share the same lunch period. So if you've got to get through that lunch line and get a lunch, we might be fighting with 200 or 300 kids for space in that lunch line. Not literally fighting, but it could take a while to get through. PE is a separate class, and very often students have to change into a PE uniform or gym clothes or something. So it's a lot more to navigate. Next slide, please. And like I said before, the schools are very big compared to some of our teeny tiny elementary schools. We have elementary schools here in San Francisco that are 200-300 kids, and our middle schools on average are more like 1,200 kids. Different teachers have their own expectations surrounding classwork, homework, grading rubrics, etc. Can your students stay on top of it? Can you, as an adult, imagine having 6 or 8 different bosses with different expectations, with different assignment timelines and deadlines, different ways they communicate? It's challenging for us adults, let alone our students. Google Classroom and Student View are often the main means of communication outside of class. Does your student know how to navigate these tech platforms independently? Can they manage all the emails and tech requirements independently? I don't know if anyone's looked through Google Classroom, but my ADHD brain, it's not organized in a way that is easy for me to help my kids find anything in there. Transition between bells is usually 4 minutes. How far does your child have to move between periods? Can your student make it to their locker, get supplies, change books, and get to the next class between bells? Bathrooms, lockers, and locker rooms, ugh, that brings up a whole nother set of issues for many of our kids. But along with some of these challenges come more resources as well. Middle schools very often have wellness centers. They have counseling centers. They have after school clubs, lunchtime clubs. They have sports, after school programs. So there's a lot. And sometimes helping our students find what is best for them takes a little bit. It takes a minute, as the kids would say. And there are often more academic delivery options. Instead of just gen ed or a special day class, sometimes we have co-taught classes, co-taught with a gen ed teacher and a special ed teacher, with differentiation built into the classroom and the curriculum. SDC, special day class, is what that stands for. RSP, related service provider. Sometimes we have teachers that push into classrooms for part of the day or for part of the subject. A lot of our middle schools have separate periods. An elective period can be study skills, where their special ed teacher will actually work with them on some of this management and homework and all the stuff that they have to navigate in middle school. That can be very, very powerful. Next slide, please. And more changes to consider beyond what's in the school building, beyond the school day. So in middle school, this is a time where we see many more neurotypical kids start to take public transportation, Muni, to and from school. My daughter, a lot of her elementary school classmates met at their elementary school when their younger siblings were being dropped off. Parents would bring them there, and then they got on the bus together, and they all went to their middle school together. Um, uh, a lot of different elementary schools have things like that. Sometimes this is when our kids get their first phone, and so we give them more freedom in the city, right? But if that's what all the neurotypical kids are doing, is that something that your student can do as well? Students from many elementary schools and school cultures merge into middle school. Does your student have the social skills to navigate this and make new friends? What are your students' interests? Can they find bright spots in their elective, in a sport, in a club? This is a great time for them to explore new things. And we could give completely separate presentations on digital and social media literacy, puberty. Yeah, we're just going to put a pin in puberty. Never a dull moment when it comes to that part of the middle school experience. So next slide, please. All right, so the link here at the bottom of the screen, that is a great resource that has a lot of questions to ask for parents of students with disabilities when you're touring any school. Helps you dig into the differences between the different options that you're considering. Which brings us to the first point. Have you toured your student's new school? Did the tour include anything about the special education department? Did you get to see any of the classrooms or talk to any of the personnel? Are there upcoming welcome events for new families? And how much information do you have about your student's schedule? So just make sure when you have your transition meeting, this is a great opportunity to ask a lot of questions about what your child's day is going to be like and individualize it. Remember, IEP, that I is individualized. Next slide, please. Okay, now, understanding some of the differences in middle school, how does that lead us into tweaks and changes for the middle school IEP? Next slide, please. Okay, so we use this IEP flowchart in every single presentation. We think it's really important to make sure that families and school personnel are on the same page when we talk about special education. And anyone who's been through the enrollment process knows that when we talk about school access as families, and first thing we see is placement, right? We have to go fill out an application and put down schools. We have to pick schools. And from there, maybe whether or not an SD special day class or gen ed environment is going to be most appropriate. But that's where we start as parents, is school choice. Now, for the special education professionals who do this for a living, when they think about IEP development, instead, what they're thinking about is they're thinking about this process here on this slide. And we often hear that referred to as needs drive goals, goals drive services. And so, Karma, I don't want to steal any of your thunder, so I'm going to turn it over to you and let you take it away.
Thank you, Lee. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm Karma Cook-Penwala, and I am the Director of Advocacy at CASE. Lee and I work together to head up the organization and make sure that families in San Francisco have a place of support to navigate the special education process here in the Bay Area. So I was the kid with the IEP. I'm deaf. I had an IEP from kindergarten through graduating high school. So this process is very personal to me. As Lee said, when we get to middle school, we want to identify all the ways that middle school can be different from elementary school. And we have to make sure that we remember the IEP framework, the rules of the IEP still apply in this process. When you get nervous or scared about this big new world of middle school, just remember you can fall back on the IEP to make sure that your child has the supports and services they need to navigate this new world. Let's go to the next slide. Remember, we start with getting the needs of the student understood. We have to assess for those needs. We can't find out all of the needs of a student unless we assess first. So why do we assess? Well, here's an example. Many people may think a student has ADHD, but if we don't assess, maybe we're missing out on the fact that what we think is ADHD is actually depression or an anxiety disorder or hearing loss or an auditory processing disorder or PTSD or a neurological disorder. Many of the different conditions and disabilities on this slide are mistaken for ADHD. So to make sure we truly understand the student's disability and how it will impact them in the classroom, we have to do a comprehensive assessment in all areas of suspected disability. Next slide. It's also important to remember that for students who receive services outside of school through private or medical speech and language pathologists, or private or medical occupational therapists, or private or medical physical therapists, or any other type of therapy, that medical therapy may have a different purpose than the therapies that our students receive at school. And that's because at school, we need to give the student only what they need to access the educational environment. Developmental or medical or private therapies have a different purpose because we're looking at the longevity or the physical health and the medical well-being of that child. But that's not what we're looking for at school. We're just looking to make sure that that student has access to their educational environment and to their education. So under the IDEA, a student who's receiving special education services does not get a diagnosis. They are made eligible under certain categories of disability under the IDEA or educational eligibility. Some of them might coincide with actual disabilities and diagnosis, but the two don't always match up when you consider educational eligibility versus medical eligibility. The IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, the federal law for special education, lays out the criteria for being made eligible under each category of disability in the law. It is the IEP team, which includes the parents and the families, that makes the determination of eligibility for services under the IDEA. And schools identify disabilities based on the eligibility categories of the IDEA, not on the medical definitions. The disabilities and conditions must affect the child's ability to function in the classroom or elsewhere in school at the time they are identified. And the timing is also very important. On the flip side, a medical diagnosis could be found under the ICD-10 or the DSM-5 manuals. Those are very, very different and have very different definitions of disabilities or disabling conditions. So they have to be identified by a medical professional, a doctor, an optometrist, a child psychologist, pediatric neuropsychologist, psychiatrist, or other clinical professional has to make that diagnosis. Medical professionals diagnose and treat conditions that are found in the DSM-5, and the conditions don't have to affect school performance in order for those clinicians to diagnose them. So understanding the difference between educational eligibility and medical eligibility is so important as we begin to identify all of the needs of a student to go in the individualized education plan. Next slide. Next slide, please. Here are the eligibility categories: autism, deafblindness, deafness, emotional disturbance, hearing impairment, really hard of hearing, intellectual disability, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairment, other health impairment, specific learning disability, speech or language impairment, traumatic brain injury, and visual impairment. When students have at least 2 or 3 of these conditions combined, oftentimes the school district and the IEP team will recommend that the student be made eligible under multiple disabilities. On the right-hand column, you'll see other health impairment, or OHI. OHI is sort of a catch-all for disabilities such as ADHD or diabetes or any other condition that can't fall under one of the other 12 disability eligibility categories. Next slide. When we assess students with disabilities, one of the first initial assessments we'll do is a psychoeducational assessment. And that assessment looks at cognitive, academic, social, behavioral, and emotional skills of a student. There are 7 areas of cognitive and thinking skills that we want to assess: crystallized knowledge and verbal reasoning, fluid reasoning and nonverbal problem solving, visual spatial processing, short-term memory, long-term retrieval, auditory and phonological processing, a student's processing speed. These might sound a bit technical and may be kind of hard to understand, but all of these skills go directly to a student's ability to understand what was said, process it, and put meaning to what was said, hold on to that meaning and remember it, and apply it in a different way or different context. It can also mean that we understand how students learn. How long does it take them to read a passage? How quickly do they remember this, an order of numbers or things that were said to them? How quickly do they hear or understand what is being said verbally? And how long can they memorize a fact or a concept that they learned? These are all so important to help us understand how a student will access their education and where in their school they should be educated. Next slide. Additional skills that we assess are sensory motor. For example, visual motor integration is so important when we are copying a shape or copying a drawing or copying letters written on the board. Attention and executive functioning. How long can a student attend or focus on a lesson being presented to them in class? Can they sustain that attention over time? Can they start tasks on their own? Can they switch from one mental task to another mental task remember instructions that a teacher gives them, or juggle multiple tasks at the same time. Then there's orthographic processing, the ability to use a visual system to form, store, and recall words, as well as letter strings needed to recognize words. This is all how we break down language. Next slide. We also assess a student's social emotional skills, their ability to identify and understand their own feelings, or to accurately read and comprehend the emotions of other people, to manage strong emotions that they have, and to regulate their own behavior, to develop empathy for other people, and to establish and maintain relationships. We also need to look at the adaptive skills of students. Can they independently and effectively take complete functional living skills to take care of themselves and to interact with other people? It's so important for us to be able to understand whether a student has the ability to zip, unzip, button, pull up, or push down, especially when it comes to things like toileting needs and how independently our students can use the restroom at school. Or how quickly can they get dressed and changed for PE in middle school? When we start taking a look at all of these different skills, then we can start to understand what the needs of our students are, especially when they make that big jump from elementary school, where they receive more support, to middle school, where they become more independent. Next slide, please. Understanding the bell curve. Okay, when we do our assessments and we look at these assessments, whether it's the initial assessment, the triennial assessment, or an independent assessment outside of the school district, the bell curve helps us understand where the student is compared with every other student their age and grade level. We'll do a much more in-depth workshop on this later, but it's important to understand that the darkest blue two sections in the middle of this curve are average. One shade lighter to the left means below average. One shade lighter to the left is significantly below average or low. And on the furthermost left side of that curve is extremely low. Likewise, to the right, we begin to see the above average, significantly above average, and extremely above average. But the vast majority of students are going to fall in that darkest blue two columns right in the middle of the curve. The assessments that are done to identify all of these needs of students with disabilities are going to be graded or scaled and scored on this curve. Next slide, please. In addition to doing assessments and test batteries, there are so many other ways that we get information to tell us about students' needs. For example, we must do observations, interviews, rating scales from teachers and parents. We take a look at grades and work samples, or curriculum-based assessments that are given at school each year. And we also look at standardized test scores. That quote in the middle, in conducting the evaluation, the public agency must use a variety of assessment tools and strategies to gather relevant, functional, developmental, and academic information about the child, including, and this is the important part, information provided by the parent. That is a direct quote from the IDEA, from the federal law. Next slide. So what are the components of a strong assessment report? First of all, anytime there is an assessment, with the exception of an independent assessment, there is a timeline attached to that assessment. So we want to see that the assessment is done timely and the IEP team meets within the timeline set forward by the law to review the assessment of the student. That assessment must include student history that gives the assessor the context to understand how the student's previous educational experience may or may not impact them now. Of course, parent, family, and outside provider interviews and reports and feedback should absolutely be included. And the assessor should observe the student in multiple settings across any given school day. That assessor should observe the student in a classroom, in a playground, and lunch, and during times of transition. We want to see a variety of assessment tools used in each area that is being assessed, not just one tool or test or rating scale, multiple. And finally, in that assessment report, we want to see eligibility determination recommendations for the IEP team to consider. And more importantly, we want to see recommendations for accommodations and other classroom supports, even goal areas in that assessment report. When we see a report that has all of those items in it, we know the school has done an excellent job of trying to assess the student in all areas of need and in all areas related to their disability. Next slide. So what about an IEE? Well, if the assessment was missing any of the components that we just discussed, or if the parent disagrees on another reason with the school district's report, the parent has the right to an independent educational evaluation at school district expense. What are the pros and cons of this? Well, the pro is that additional data from an independent specialist might be often more thorough and give the team more information that it needs to make a determination of eligibility or to provide better goals, services, and supports for the student. The cons, well, sometimes these assessments can be time consuming if you have to wait for an assessor to be available. Sometimes they can be expensive and more expensive than the school district is willing to pay. Sometimes it can delay the implementation of an IEP, especially if the parent requests that assessment immediately after the triennial or initial evaluation, where updates to the IEP would be made immediately after the school district's own assessment. And sometimes, although this is rare, sometimes the IEE doesn't give us new information that we're looking for. Before a parent or family requests an independent educational evaluation, we should make every attempt to understand and interpret the data we have from the school district's own assessment. We should collaborate with the team and the IEP meetings to discuss the school district assessment and make sure that we ask the team questions about those reports and give them an opportunity to answer questions. We should also try to understand how the data we have will impact the student in the classroom. And can we take any other data to make the case to the team that an IEE is necessary? And think about the goal for your student's education. Can the IEP team, help you reach that goal with the data you already have? Or is there data missing and that you need and that an independent assessment can give you? And oftentimes, we want to make sure we have all the data in front of us that we need as we are looking at this brand new world of middle school. Next slide. Remember, when we do these assessments to determine the need of students in special education, we're not just looking at academic impact, we're looking at educational impact. Education is so much more than just the academics. We have to take a look at the social emotional skills of the student, their adaptive skills, their behavior, and so much more. Do you know exactly how your child's disability will impact them in the classroom? Not just on learning the material that is taught, but how to make friends. Can they actually make their way independently from a classroom on the third floor to the cafeteria or the gymnasium on the first floor? Can you make your case to the rest of the team for gathering more data? If not, what other information do you need to make the best IEP you can as your child grows and moves on into the next stage of their academic career? Next slide. So, how do you make your case? You get information from the current school, progress reports, any letters sent home, notes from teachers and staff, observations, and then information from any outside medical or private providers you've got, especially letters focusing on how the disability impacts the student and their educational environment. And we cannot emphasize enough that we can always use more information on safety at school. Next slide. So what are some of those potential non-academic areas of need? We can group them in more or less three categories. That first category is executive function, planning and prioritization, task initiation, time management, organization, emotional regulation, and impulse control, flexible thinking, goal setting and self-monitoring, stamina and perseverance. Then self-advocacy. Can students ask for help and communicate with the adults around them? Do they have coping strategies for getting through their school day, their ups and downs? And do they have metacognition skills? Other areas to consider: mental health, their chronic illness or needs related to health, such as diabetes, epilepsy. Technology use. How well do students use technology? Are they using social media off campus that might impact them in the classroom? What about self-care? And what about their behavior and their social, emotional, or social skills needs? Next slide. The LSUB. We're going to drop the link to the LSUB in the chat. We're not going to review everything here, but this is a great checklist for you to look at as your child goes off to middle school to determine if there's anything else that should be going into that IEP that their non-disabled peers are able to do. Next slide. And even more, here's some questions to ask, whether it's questions to ask of yourself and your child, or to ask of the IEP team. Of course, you'll be getting these slides, so don't feel the need to run through them or read them right now. Next slide, please. Okay, so we just talked about the needs of the student and how we identify those needs. Now let's move on to goals. After all, needs drive goals. So once we know what the needs of the students are, we can hopefully create goals around those needs. Next slide. So why are IEP goals so important? The goals are what gets the student to be involved in and make progress in the general education curriculum, which is also often aligned to the Common Core standards or age level expectations. We want to address each educational need of the student that results from the disability, regardless of the disability category. Just because a student is eligible under OHI doesn't mean that they might also need some support with occupational therapy. Just because they're an OHI doesn't mean they can't get any other service in the IEP. That's why we do a holistic assessment in all areas of suspected disability, so that we can meet each educational need of the student. We have to meet the student's unique needs in an individual manner. We can't provide the same service in the same way to all students because that's not individualized. We also have to measure student growth and success using these goals. Does the student get to their expected destination? Did they meet their goal? Did they make progress? Is the IEP providing meaningful educational benefit? The goals are our best accountability mechanism in the IEP process. It allows us to see the progress that students are making when they start with their baseline and end up at the goal. Next slide, please. As I just mentioned, each goal starts with a measurable baseline. Now, there was something in that first slide about needs drive goals, goals drive services that I skipped over. And that's that we want a SMART goal. And the SMART goal means it's an acronym. The S stands for specific. The M stands for measurable. The A stands for achievable. The R stands for relevant, and the T is time bound. When you have a goal that meets all of those things, you have a good goal. But we have to start with a measurable baseline. The baseline can't just describe where the student is now. It actually has to take data and it has to have a number in there. How many times is the student able to do a particular skill? On how many opportunities are they able to complete it? Are they doing something 40% of the time? Are they able to do it in 3 out of 5 opportunities? We need to make sure there's a number in that baseline. And if you don't see a number in your baselines, we need to get that number and have the school take a snapshot of the student's current ability. Skills in the baseline must match the skills being measured in the goal. And in fact, teams can actually just copy and paste the wording from the baseline into the goal itself, or from the goal into the baseline. We want to measure the same goal, not different goals. Assessment should result from the triennial assessment or the annual testing are not appropriate measures to use. If you look in your baseline and you see a score from the assessment that was just done on your student, we need to go back and actually have the school assess the skill in the classroom, not just take the score from the test. And the baselines have to have real data, and in fact should be taken from the present levels section of the IEP. If your child has an IEP, you know that the present levels are basically pages 2 through 5, more or less, of your student's IEP. And that's the great place to get information for the goals. Next slide, please. What does the goal look like? Here's the formula. Here is the wording of the goals. By January 31st, 2025, the student will be able to, in the general education classroom or in the class, be able to do a skill as measured by with accuracy and with what supports. When you review this slide after tonight's presentation, take this slide and compare it to goals that are in your child's IEP, if they have one, and see what is missing and what isn't, and compare the wording in the goal to the wording in the IEP. Next slide, please. So what is the standard for the goals? How do we know that the goals are working? Well, goals must be appropriately ambitious for a student. We want to push our students. And in middle school, that's oftentimes when we see such low standards placed on students with disabilities. Just because a student has a disability doesn't mean we should lower our standards and expectations for them to make progress. If anything, we want to increase our expectations because we know our kids with disabilities have the ability to make progress. So here's how you do that, folks. In order to meet its substantive obligation under the IDEA, a school must offer an IEP reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. In other words, goals must be appropriately ambitious in light of the child's individual circumstances. So we really want to make sure that we're pushing our kids to make progress. And we're not just giving them a little bit of an opportunity. We really want to work with them and make sure they're pushing their way to that general education curriculum or pushing their way to that age-appropriate skill. This is the standard we hold the school districts. How far do we think our kids can go? Let's see them get there. Next slide. So again, what does appropriately ambitious actually mean? Well, if a child is not making expected progress towards his or her annual goals, the IEP team must revise as appropriate the IEP to address the lack of progress. Yes, the IEP team can come back to the drawing board, come back to the table and revise the IEP. Did you know that the IEP can be redone and changed and revised and updated at any time? It absolutely can. And that's because we want to make sure that we're seeing students make progress. And when they're not quite making all that progress we want, we can go back and revise the goal to be what actually is appropriately ambitious for that student. The IEP must be appropriately ambitious in light of the student's circumstances, just as advancement from grade to grade is appropriately ambitious for most children in the regular classroom. And finally, in a situation where a child is performing significantly below the level of the grade in which the child is enrolled, an IEP team should determine annual goals that are ambitious but achievable. And the goals should be sufficiently ambitious to help close the gap between where the student is and where we want that student to be, which is, of course, the grade level curriculum, standard, or age level expectation. Next slide. And here are the resources for you as parents and families in starting those conversations on appropriately ambitious goals around grade level standards. The California Common Core Math Standards for math goals, the Common Core ELA standards for English and language arts, the dyslexia guidelines for students who have dyslexia and maybe dysgraphia or dyscalculia, the written language production for handwriting and typing, the California PE content model standards, and many, many more. For students who are deaf and hard of hearing, for example, there's the California Deaf Child Bill of Rights. We take a look at all of these resources to see what is appropriate in terms of implementing different teaching methods, accommodations, goals, services, supports, and more for children with disabilities as they make their way through their education and work towards progress on goals. Next slide. We want to set students up for success. Students don't magically meet goals on their own. How are we giving them the skills to meet these goals? We want to make sure that the goals include language such as with social skills training and modeling, or with access to a graphic organizer or pre-drawn model or scribing notes, or with a visual schedule, or with access to a wellness center or a preferred adult. These are the tools that we can give students to help them work on the skill set and make progress. So we need to consider what level of prompting, assistance, and redirection is required for that student to meet the goal. Do we want to fade to independence as much as possible? Absolutely. What accommodations are needed to achieve the goal? And are they written into the goal, like checklists, graphic organizers, social skills group, and more? Next slide. Best practice. Include short-term objectives so they can determine if the student is making progress on that goal. Make sure you're getting your progress reports that come with your report cards. And if you're not getting progress reports that update you on the progress your child has made on their goals, ask your teacher and your school for those progress reports. The goals should be jargon-free. Anyone should be able to understand what the goal says and what the student is expected to do. And ask yourself and the team, when next year's teachers, therapists, and other professionals implement this goal in middle school, will they know what we expect the student to do and how the student will achieve it? Next slide. So, awesome. How do we use this information in middle school? Well, here's a list of questions we want you to review and consider as you plan for your transition IEP meetings later this spring. One big question we have, who is responsible for implementing and monitoring the goals in the IEP? What support will that staff have to make sure that they are working and implementing the IEP at all times? Next slide. Okay, we've gotten through the needs. We've gotten through the goals. Now let's look at services.
Karma,
Yes.
can I just make a connection between the needs and the goals? We
Go for
saw a
it.
slide. We saw a slide all about some of the needs that are not academic, like executive function, self-advocacy, social skills. And these are very often the goals, those needs drive goals in our middle school IEPs. For example, for students who are struggling with work completion, now that instead of one homework packet every week, they have different assignments and different times of the week and different expectations from different teachers, it can be overwhelming. So very often we'll add a work completion goal in middle school, so that a student is across all settings, across all classes, so that they are in fact getting so they are getting all of their work turned in all of their classes, maybe across 90% of all measured opportunities or something like that. But that's one of the areas. Asking for help. Some of our students get very shy in front of new peers and aren't willing to raise their hand and ask for help. So we might see self-advocacy goals around students asking for help. So these are why you saw those areas of need. Those areas of need can lead to these new goals in middle school. And then now Karma will talk about the services they'll lead to.
That's a great point. Thank you, Lee. And yes, as someone working with middle school students right now, I can tell you we're definitely putting work completion goals in the IEPs. Next slide. So what can accommodations and services look like in the AEP? Whatever the student's needs and whatever the student needs them to look like. Next slide. Accommodations and modifications. These are two things that we'll often see and hear about in the IEP process. They're very different. And so what are they? Well, both of them are part of instruction and assessment, and both of them have to be documented in the IEP. The accommodations changes how the skills and the standards are taught to students. It helps the students demonstrate learning or mastery of the skill or standard, and there are 5 categories of them: timing, scheduling, presentation, response, and setting. On the other hand, the modifications will change or lower the learning expectations, but not necessarily access to the standards. And it changes what is being taught. My favorite example of accommodations versus modifications is to imagine a, a paper sheet of 12 math problems: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, in order from easiest to hardest. The accommodation for someone who would take half the amount of time or twice as long to complete that assignment as their non-disabled peers would be for them to do half the worksheet up and down. So they're still completing the easiest to the hardest material. But for students who need a modification, those students would do only half of that worksheet from the top or the bottom. So they're only doing the easiest 6. Now, they would still be working on some of the same content that the non-disabled peers would be, but they're just not working on all of it. That's how you look at the difference between the accommodation and the modification. Next slide, please. So again, how do we tell what it is? Ask. Has the student been asked to demonstrate Common Core mastery, but just in a different way? Are we expecting students to learn and understand the exact same content as their non-disabled peers? And is this same grading or rubric used for all students? What is being taught to the Common Core standards? Next slide. Overly vague accommodations, not always helpful. Check for understanding, preferential seating, extra time, providing support as needed. Make sure the IEP team knows exactly what is needed as part of that accommodation. For example, check for understanding really should be, okay, let's review the last 3 concepts that you just heard. Preferential seating is wherever the student needs it to be, and then the team should make determinations on each of these so they're concrete and exact and specific. Next slide. We're going to rush through this as we're a little bit short on time here, and we still have a lot to cover. But come back and review these slides. because we need to make sure that we understand the accommodations in the IEP and the modifications, and so does the IEP team. Next slide. So where can we get more information? There's a huge appendix. When this presentation is over and you're reviewing the slides later, please go to the appendix, the last slides in this presentation that we're not going to show you tonight, and review those. There are so many places to get information, and we're more than happy to share them with you. Next slide. So what do services look like in the IEP? Again, whatever you need them to look like. Next slide. The IEP must include a clear description of all services the student will receive, including the level, the location where the instruction will be provided, and any additional services and modifications the student will receive to enable them to make progress academically or outside of academically. For each service, the IEP must provide details on the frequency, duration, and location of the service. Next slide, please. So here's an example of determining appropriate academic services. We mentioned this book earlier, and we encourage you to come back and take a look at this slide.
Karma, can I make this through line connection real quick?
Yes.
I think this is one of those very important, dyslexia is a great example of how we use that needs drive goals, goals drive services as a connection, and how we use the best practices and resources in the industry and with research to make sure that we tie it all together. So for our students with dyslexia, we know they very often struggle with the foundational skills of orthographic mapping, phonemic awareness. If you've got a kid with dyslexia, this is not new to you. If you don't, you can take these same concepts and apply it to whatever your students' areas of needs are. So for dyslexia, because students struggle to make that connection between letter sound correspondence, there's a whole lot that this California Dyslexia Guidelines lays out for our students and our instructors about how to best intervene to prevent dyslexia. And there's a lot of brain research that's been done over the past 20 years. We know the science of reading and structured literacy are the best practices that we need in order to help teach our kids to read. So what that looks like in the IEP, we identify those areas of need, and best practices for a student with dyslexia is to have goals in 5 areas: phonemic awareness. Of course, now off the top of my head, I'm struggling to think of all of them. But phonemic awareness, decoding, blending, breaking words apart, being able to identify their sounds, and then being able to take them and build them back together. Reading fluency, reading comprehension. And when a student's spelling improves, we know they've tied it all together and they've really mastered those skills. So a spelling goal is very often included in an IEP for a student with dyslexia. So then, okay, we've got all these goals. Where are we going to actually provide these services? So what that looks like in middle school, kids aren't still learning to read in their English language arts. We're assuming that in that class, everything they have to do, it's based on the fact that they are already proficient readers. So maybe they need a separate classroom. Maybe some of our schools actually have reading intervention classrooms where they use programs like Spire and Wilson. These are structured literacy programs. And so that might be the elective class for some of our students. But we also know from these California Dyslexia Guidelines and from the implementation manuals of Spire and Wilson and other programs like them that the best practices for students with dyslexia is to make sure that they are getting 45 to 60 minutes per day of specialized instruction, and that it's in a small group environment along with no more than 2 or 3 peers who are at their same level. So if you have a student with dyslexia who's not reading at grade level yet, and all of a sudden the team is saying, all right, well, we're going to put them into the Spire class next year. How about that? Well, the follow-up questions that we have are, well, wait a minute, how many kids are in the class? How are we going to make sure they're all at the same level as my student? Because if you've got some kids at level 1 and some kids at level 6, Who are you teaching to? So making sure that the instruction is appropriate for your student is a big part of this whole implementation process. And so that's where maybe this is a great fit, or maybe after school tutoring, before school tutoring, some other form of specialized academic instruction might actually meet your students' needs. So now that's an example for dyslexia. We could do the same thing, for for autism, and use the social skills example. There's many other ways that we could make that through line, and we're hoping that this presentation has given you the foundational building blocks to figure out your student's area of need, write goals in all those areas needs, and then do the research into the best practices to figure out what the appropriate services are. Okay, thank you, Karma, for letting me intercede and give that through line.
You're welcome, Lee. All right, next slide, please. So how do we determine what services are needed? We want to make sure that anything provided to students in their IEPs is evidence-based practices, and especially evidence-based instruction or related services like speech, nursing, counseling, occupational therapy, and so forth, and that any para or aid supports are necessary to support the student in reaching their goals. So services should be provided to support all goals. If you take a look at the goals in your IEP, you should see related services in the services grid on the last few pages that go directly to supporting those goals. If you've got academic and reading goals in the IEP, you should see SAIs, specialized academic instruction minutes, that go towards supporting those goals. If you've got speech and language goals in that IEP, you're going to see speech and language services to implement those goals. So the more goals in one particular area, the more minutes of service that should be provided to support those goals in the IEP. It would be so incredibly helpful if in the IEP and the services grid, they said speech and language services, 30 minutes a week to support goals 1 and 4. Unfortunately, they don't always do that way, and they leave that part of the puzzle for parents to figure out. But we're here to tell you, the goals and the services should line up. Make sure that those services are very specific about when and where those services will be provided. Is there a resource teacher who will push in to your student's classroom to help them understand what is happening, to work on strategies for organization or for working on specific academic skills? Or will there be pull out to work one-on-one on articulation with a speech and language pathologist? If there are social or group skills involved, then maybe there will be small group speech so the students get to work on their skills with a peer who's also working on the same skills they are. It's also important to understand the difference between direct services and consultation. Direct services are minutes that are provided from the related services provider or from the teacher to the student. Consultation, on the other hand, are minutes that are provided from the related services provider to the teachers and staff to help them implement parts of the IEP and support the student in the process. Maybe it's help with assistive technology. Maybe it's certain strategies or things to say or how to redirect a student, how to check for understanding so that the student knows what has just happened in class. And finally, is there time written into the IEP for your service providers to collaborate and communicate with each other, with you, and with any outside independent professionals? Next slide, please.
I also want to highlight just how important that collaboration is in middle school and that communication, because very often our students' case manager, they're either only one of 5 or 6 teachers that our student has, or sometimes our case managers don't see the student academically throughout the day at all. So making sure that there is time built in where that case manager is collaborating with the general ed teachers and the other teachers. And gen ed teachers don't often get to see the whole IEP. So making sure that they've got the support from someone who does know your student's IEP is really important.
Absolutely. Thanks, Lee. Next slide. Related services. Here we go. What are all the different related services that we can see in the IEP? Here they are listed in front of you. Some of them are pretty obvious, some of them less so, like medical services from a nurse or even from an optometrist or ophthalmologist, like vision therapy, which is a medical service that can be provided in an IEP, or parent counseling and training, and psychological services and counseling. Social work can be provided in schools. And if a student needs assistance getting to a school for their education because of their placement, transportation can and should be provided. Next slide. Remember, the least restrictive environment is not a place. It's not a physical space. The IDEA talks about FAPE, a free appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. So what that means is we have to have a discussion about FAPE, what is appropriate, and then we have to figure out where on this spectrum that you see in front of you, FAPE, the appropriate education, can be provided. Can it be provided in the general education classroom? Or do we start to need to build on more and more services? Or do we need to be in a self-contained special day class? Or do we need to be at a non-public school? Or do we need to be at a residential treatment center? Whatever it is, the least restrictive environment requirements are for each public agency to ensure that to the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities, including children in public or private institutions, are educated with children who are non-disabled, and that special classes or removing children with disabilities from the regular educational environment occurs only if the nature or severity of the disability is such that education and regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. That means we don't want to move the aides or paras away from a student and put them in a special day class if the student has been thriving in a general education classroom with dedicated aid support. We can't do that just because we move to middle school. Again, the framework of the IDEA and the framework of special education law moves with the student from elementary school to middle school. And that leap does not necessarily mean that the student's placement should be changed. Remember that. Next slide. So there's a continuum of placements that was just on that slide we shot earlier, from the general education classroom all the way up to the residential treatment center. And having that continuum of placements is intended to ensure that a child with disability is served in the setting where the child can be successfully educated in the least restrictive environment. And there have to be a determination of various factors on an individual basis to determine what the least restrictive environment is. And there are other places we can consider: home hospital instruction, virtual instruction, and non-public schools. I encourage you to check out this checklist after the presentation is over, because these have so many important factors to consider as you determine what the least restrictive environment is for your child. All right, we're going to skip the next few slides. Can you get us to slide 67, please? There we go. Advocacy best practices, tips from the pros. Lee, take it away.
All right, we have just thrown a lot of information at everyone. There is a method to the madness, though. Understanding how to identify areas of need and then write strong goals and use that to get the services that your student needs is so, so critical. But even understanding that sometimes we still need to push a little bit to make that process work smoothly. So couple really important key points from us and what makes the work we do so successful. Here's our advice to you. First and foremost, put everything in writing. Document, document, document. If you didn't write it down, it's like it didn't happen. Over communicate with all members of the team, especially in middle school. This is so important. Like I mentioned before, your child doesn't have just one teacher anymore. It's 5, 6, 7 teachers. And sometimes you have to be that bridge in communicating with everyone. Um, if you always have the right to request your students' records, particularly in the movement from middle school to from elementary school to middle school, making sure that you have all the documentation. This might be a good time to request those records. Have them before you move to middle school in case anyone has any questions. And we in the special education rights and responsibilities manual, we put the link to that in earlier. The appendix section has some great sample letters for you. One is how to request an assessment. One is how to request records. There's a lot of others in there too. Some great information. You can request an IEP meeting as soon as any concerns arise. We went through the timelines earlier. We always encourage families to record their IEP meetings. There's a lot that happens in an IEP meeting. It's hard to pay attention and focus and take notes and do everything. So having a recording, something that you can review later to make sure you capture it all, is super helpful. You have to give the school at least 24 hours notice in writing. And we use an app called otter.ai at Case because you can record up to an hour and a half for free. And it gives you a transcript as well. So it's super helpful to be able to read that through afterwards as well. And keep a copy of everything. Everything. We always recommend that folks use the understood.org guideline in organizing an IEP binder for your student. Especially by the time you get to middle school, you usually have a couple of years worth of documentation. Having it all organized for your new team who doesn't have that same level of experience can be super helpful. Next slide, please. And you know what? It's okay. We talked about meaningful parental participation. It's okay to ask questions. In fact, you should. We absolutely suggest that you ask lots of clarifying questions and make sure that your team has all the information too. Sometimes when you ask the question, other people on the team want to know the answer to that same question. They just didn't want to speak up. So always ask. Your 2 favorite words through the IEP process are appropriate and reasonable. That's as you're asking about things, is this appropriate for a student my age, or for me as a parent to be asking, is this reasonable? If you can frame it from that standpoint, well, I think this is a reasonable request because of blah, blah, blah. That's very, very helpful. Um, and we've talked a lot about this, but make sure everything in the IEP process is individualized. We use the example of dyslexia and the reading intervention class. There's a lot of things in the process where schools don't have all the resources they need. We recognize that. And so they try and do the best they can with what they have. And sometimes that means grouping kids in a way that isn't always individualized. Sometimes that works, but sometimes it doesn't. And there can be a tension in that, and we just acknowledge it and we recognize it, and we give the folks who are working hard in the school sites kudos for doing the best they can with what they have. And sometimes, we have some very complex kiddos. Sometimes there just aren't enough minutes in the day to provide all the therapies and services and everything else we want. So then we have to figure out, what are our priorities? What do we pick and choose? What is the most important? And also, your child better than anyone. You are your child's first teacher. The strategies that work at home might be helpful to the team to know at school. So please share. You are a meaningful participant of the team. And we very often, when we go into IEPs, I personally usually tell teams we're going to need at least 2 hours. I ask a lot of questions. I provoke a lot of intentional conversations. We're not just going to blow right through the IEP. We're going to ask a lot and make sure everything's individualized. So can you please schedule a 2-hour meeting instead of a 1? And for families whose first language is not English, who will have an interpreter in the meeting, even more importantly, you should be asking for a 2-hour meeting at least, to make sure that there is time to cover everything. That consecutive interpretation, as you know, can take a long time. It can add time to the meeting. And so no one should feel rushed to get through everything. You should have the time to have all the conversations you need. So definitely ask for longer meetings. Next slide, please. Okay, understanding the people in the process. We've spent a lot of time walking through the process today, but make sure you have the contact list for your school district. In fact, in San Francisco Unified, the San Francisco website has a whole, if you go to sfusd.edu/SPED, the org chart is right there. You can get the whole list of everyone, what school what cohort your school is in, if you have any questions, who to reach out to. And we always say follow the chain of command. If you're upset, things aren't going well at your school, emailing the superintendent or the school board isn't necessarily going to solve your problem. In fact, what's going to happen is it's going to trickle back down to your school. If people are going to get it back down the chain to ask questions and find out what's going on, and then you're just going to have some people who are upset, like, hey, why didn't you reach out to me? We could have solved this another way. So always follow that chain of command. Work it up, not down. There are a lot of great resources like alternative dispute resolution. If you're stuck, there's facilitated IEPs where trained facilitators and mediators from the Bar Association can come in and help unstick things. And you've noticed in our presentation here, there's a lot of ed code citations. That's one of the things that we always request. When you go to the Special Education Rights and Responsibilities Manual and you look at some of those sample letters, you will see that the ed code citations are listed there, because when your team knows that you know the education code, it shows you know your rights, and it shows that they have to take you seriously. It gets people's attention. So use those ed code citations where you have them. And remember that all of these federal and state laws, they supersede local policies. We sometimes hear, well, it's our policy to do this, or we can't do that because our policy says we can't. So what we always say, well, please show me that policy. First of all, are you sure? Because nowhere in any school district policy can it state something that is counter to the state and federal laws. So I'm not sure that it really says that. Maybe we should all review that together. What do you think? Next slide, please. Okay. So here are a lot of ways that we phrase things. Just to, we want to be collaborative. We respect our teachers, we respect our paras, we respect our folks at our school sites, our related service providers. So we want to make sure that we phrase things positively. And so we're not going to read all of these questions. They're in the presentation materials, but these are just some great ways to phrase things that help you get more information. And the most important one, the one that I will read, is the last one. Please put that in writing and send it to me after the meeting. We talked about prior written notice, and there are very often times in meetings where teams say, oh, we can't do that, or no, sorry. And there's never anything put in writing that states that. So make sure you get it in writing. Another thing we see very often is conversations happening in the hall as you're dropping off your student, or you're there for a conference. Someone will run up to you and have a conversation with you. We recommend documenting that. If it's something related to the IEP, if someone's trying to talk you in or out of something outside of an IEP meeting, we suggest that you go home and type up an email. Hello, administrator. Thank you so much for catching me in the hall today. It was really great to talk to you. We met in passing. I wasn't taking notes. I just want to make sure I've got this right. When you stated blah, 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 I just wanted to make sure that was my understanding too. Are we on the same page? Please confirm. Thank you. Parent name. Document, document, document. Everything should be in writing. Next slide, please. All right, we're not going to run through all of these, but very often these are some of the sticking points that we see. These are some of the most common sticking points we see. We don't work on that skill here. One of my favorite is, especially in middle school, is, well, but all students are struggling to do that. They're middle schoolers. I heard this in an IEP meeting a couple weeks ago. Well, all fifth graders have atrocious handwriting. So why should we have a handwriting goal if none of them have functional handwriting? And my response was, well, do you want me to help you write IEP goals for the whole class? Because I'm happy to do that. but we went and we saw the Zaner-Blauser handwriting standards and what a fifth grader should be able to do. We can look at those English language arts standards and we should see that all sixth graders should be writing 5, 6, 7 paragraph essays. They should have intro paragraphs. They should have body paragraphs where they can have a topic sentence, supporting details. They can cite evidence. Like all of these things are in the standards. If you don't have that expectation for all of the students in your classroom, that's a whole nother issue. But I want you to have those expectations for my student because I want my kids' content to be aligned with Common Core standards. So that's somehow some ways we push back on certain things. But anyway, we could go into a lot more detail, and we do cover these in some of our other more detailed workshops as well. So next slide, please. Informed consent. This is a really important one to understand. Just because an IEP is put in front of you at an IEP meeting doesn't mean you should sign for attendance. You should always sign for attendance, but that doesn't mean you have to sign agreeing with all the contents. You should take it home. If your first language is not English, you should wait until you have the translated copy of the document before you sign anything. Take it to support for families, have them review it, bring it to case. We can take a look at it during a consultation, and show it to a friend who has an IEP with their student. But if you're not in agreement, you can also sign with exceptions. So you can sign to get certain services starting. Say, I signed just to start this new service, but I don't agree that the whole IEP provides FAPE. We still need to work on these parts, blah, blah, blah. You can do that so that you're not holding up starting new services. And if they're trying to take services away, you can, I think we're on the next slide for that. Let's go to the next slide, please. Oh, no, it's right there. Sorry, stay put. That's okay. We're fine on this slide. Stay put. It's not a long-term solution, but if while you're working out the details of what appropriate services look like, especially going to middle school, if they say, we want to take away occupational therapy because there's not really going to be a time in the day to work on it in middle school. Wait, how's that individualized? Does my kid not need occupational therapy anymore? Have they met all their goals? Okay, that's one thing. But if you want to remove occupational therapy just because there's no place to work on it, that's not a reason. I invoke stay put. That's one of many, many examples. Okay, thank you, Flavia. Next slide, please. This time I mean it. And so a lot of things to do here when we're stuck. Please, please, please stay student-centered. Don't turn it into adult egos. No one wins when we stop talking about the student and the adults start arguing. No one wins. Let's keep it student-centered. Quit taking things personally. Ask questions, ask clarifying questions, maybe some more explanation will get everyone on the same page. Let the data tell the story. If there's an area where we're all stuck, just let's take it back to that area of need and that data that we have that tells the story, that gives the explanation of what you're trying to explain. Or if you don't have the data and you need it, well, let's go back and get more assessments. So there's a whole reason that the laws and the guidance exist. There's a whole lot of information out there for you. Some of it is available through the Special Education Rights and Responsibilities Manual. Support for Families has a lot of great guidance for you. We at CASE are always happy to help. And like we said before, a facilitated IEP or ADR can be a great solution too. Next slide, please. Trying to go through this very quickly, get you guys all out of here. So these two QR codes, one is for the Support for Families workshop calendar on their website. The other links to the CASE consultation intake form. If you have any questions, we schedule free consultations, and Support for Families, everything they do, all of the workshops, everything is free. So these are two really, really great resources. So feel free to use any of those. And all of this will be in the presentation materials that you get tomorrow from Flavia as well. So next slide, please. And there's a great community for parents in the Community Advisory Committee. It's a group of very dedicated parents who work with the district to help make sure that parent voice and advocacy is in all levels of the district. They have a monthly meeting that's fantastic. couple weeks ago, we had a great meeting about English language learners in the IEP process and the intersectionality and some of the concerns in translation and interpretation and language acquisition. It was a really great presentation that they gave. So check that out. Karma just dropped the link into the chat. Next slide, please. And SFUSD also has a new special education handbook just developed this year. So that's a great resource to learn a little bit more as well. So next slide, please. All right. Again, the Special Education Rights and Responsibilities Manual, we have a question in the chat. Who is responsible for drafting the IEP/running the IEP process in the different middle school settings, POTOT, RSP, SDC? Generally, the person who's going to be managing the paperwork, running the IEP meeting, the point person for everything special education for your student is your child's case manager. If your child is in a special day class, then the special day class teacher is very likely your case manager. If your child spends the majority of their day in general education, then very often one of the RSPs at the school site is going to be your case manager. Hopefully, if your child has study skills, their study skills teacher would be the case manager. It doesn't always work out that way. So that's part of why it's very important to make sure that the communication is strong between you and the whole team, and that there's collaboration and planning time available. And in our middle schools, we have here in San Francisco, there's been an alignment so that all middle schools have early release on Wednesday, and there is co-planning time. Sometimes it's within the school community. Sometimes it's a larger, like all the RSPs and special day class teachers will get invited to district-wide Zooms to get some special education training. That might be one week. The next week they might be sitting as an entire grade level, and so maybe the special day class teachers and the RSPs will be sitting with the math teachers to talk about differentiation. The great opportunity for communication, but we also want to have individualized communication and collaboration built in there as much as possible. I hope that answered the question. So next slide, please. If there are any more questions, by the way, please pop them into the chat, because that's exactly where we are in the presentation now. But hopefully we gave you that through line between making sure that all of you, getting the data that you need. That's the foundation that builds the house. Use that to identify areas of need. And especially once we get into middle school, those executive function skills, oh my gosh, the social skills, all of this, puberty does a number on our kids' brains too. So making sure that when we look at an IEP, it's not just the academics, but especially in middle school, the social, emotional, and the executive function play such a big part in their educational experience. So making sure that all of that is included in the IEP. We hope you can use this process to make sure that happens.